The plasma membrane itself, what we have is a double layer of phospholipids. And those phospholipids have things like carbohydrates. It also has other things like proteins embedded in it, right? So we're going to put it as a double layer. Of lipid molecules. And they're lined up side by side. If we're looking at our diagram, these little heads, lipid molecules, lined up side by side, 2 layers. You would often hear this be referred to as the phospholipid bilayer, bi meaning 2. Phospholipid, phosphorus head, lipid, or have you ever heard of a lipid before? So when we talk about carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, all of those things are those chemical compounds required for life. We see them all in the plasma membrane, meaning this is the location where the majority of these things are located in order to help facilitate different activities, especially with the cell. Now, Wes, you pointed out that the plasma membrane is on the outside edge of an animal cell. Where is it located in a plant cell? Matt, where do we see a plasma membrane in a plant cell? Do they have one?
Oh, yeah.
They have one. Okay, so we know it's there. Ilya?
It's located behind the cell wall.
Good. So we have the cell wall, which is that really hard, rigid outer part of a plant cell. And then right inside there we have that plasma membrane. One thing I want to point out, are all plant cells square? No. They tend to have flattened sides, but they're not square or rectangular. So don't be caught up in that little misconception. One thing we need to add to this is that the plasma membrane is required to allow things to move in and out. You guys mentioned that when you talked about the functions. So it's needed to move things like oxygen, and water into the cell. So oxygen and water into the cell. But then because you're putting things into the cell, you have to take some stuff out. And that's what this whole talk about osmosis and diffusion and active and passive transport is about. If we're bringing things in, something has to come out. And usually waste or things that we're trying to get rid of, especially in our bodies, the waste is in the form of carbon dioxide. So generally what we're going to see, the production, or it produces CO2 as a waste. So it's going to try and get rid of CO2 while it takes in oxygen and water. We're going to define it as allowing material to move across the membrane freely or restricting other materials. So allows some materials to move across the membrane while restricting others. That restricting others part is probably the part that students skip over. That's the important part. So when we talk about restricting others, that's the selective part. So that's the pick and choose. What are we going to let through? What are we not going to let through? What does the cell need? What does the cell need to get rid of? What does the cell need in moderation, right? We don't need everything all at once. So it's going to help regulate this process so that things don't happen too fast, and then also help us maintain something, those stable internal conditions. What's our vocab word for that? Homeostasis. Good. Now, in order to control this, you're going to see 2 different types of control. So this movement can be controlled passively or actively. meaning passively, not so much that it's restricting things, but just kind of letting things go. And then actively, where it's deciding to move something out or in. Passive transport, if we're defining passive, is movement across a membrane without using cell energy. So movement without, and I'm underlining that because that's the key part, without using the cell's energy. Active transport's the opposite. It's movement while using the cell's energy. So the active transport is going to be the processes that really require a lot of what's called ATP. Okay, so you might have talked about that a little bit with Mrs. Larson. The ATP is the form in which energy can be broken down into usable forms of energy. So active transport, movement using the cell's energy. Now we have some main types here, and you guys have practiced this. If you think back to the activity that you did with Mrs. Larson, where you guys were the plasma membrane, you did different examples of these, okay? And you may not necessarily realize that you were doing it. That website that you have the link for under your module page, I would recommend that you go back through and maybe create a list. What types are considered osmosis, or which types are considered facilitated diffusion. But some of these processes happen just by crossing the membrane, and some things need assistance going across the membrane. What can you guys think of that is an example of that? Diffusion, the first one over here on the passive transport side, diffusion refers to movement from a high area of concentration to a low area of concentration. It would be like us all standing in this room, and we're all packed in here, and so some of you just kind of say, you know what, there's a little space outside this door, so some of you start filtering out the door. We have a lot of people in here, meaning high concentration, lots of us. Not so many people outside the door, low concentration. So this happens naturally in cells. Things try to balance. Remember stable internal conditions, homeostasis? This one helps with that a lot. So movement from high areas of concentration to low. Now, osmosis is a very specific type of diffusion. It's going to be diffusion of just water. Okay, osmosis only ever involves water. So diffusion and I'm going to underline the word water because it's the key part here. So diffusion of water across the membrane. And then we have facilitated diffusion. Remember when you push somebody through the membrane in your activity? How many of you remember seeing that? You were pushing something across. That's what facilitated diffusion is when you have a protein channel assisting something across. And I'm going to put assist sugars and ions to be a little bit more specific. Oops, excuse me, spelled that wrong. Across the membrane. Water and oxygen moves on freely. Okay, but other things like potassium needs assistance. It doesn't have free control. And that's a good thing. Because if we have too much potassium within our cells, then a lot of things start to go wrong. Same thing if we have too much sodium. That's probably the one you guys have experienced the most. If you're fatigued, you've been out working really hard, and your muscles start to cramp up, what do they tell you to do?
Drink milk.
Drink water.
Chocolate milk.
eat a banana, right? Because bananas are chock full of potassium. And usually what that means is your sodium levels are too high within your cells. And if you introduce potassium into your cells, it kicks some of that sodium out. And then that's going to allow some of those muscle cramps and those things to kind of go away. On the active transport side, we have my two favorite things to talk about. I loved thinking about things engulfing or taking in things. When we talk about endocytosis, we're talking about something that gets absorbed by the cell. So it's like the cell wraps around it and just forms its membrane around the outside edge and then just pulls it in. It's kind of like if you were to give a hug to your teddy bear, but then all of a sudden your teddy bear becomes part of you. It's kind of weird, right? But it happens all the time in cells. They just kind of surround this little piece of something, whatever it is, and then they absorb it. So they do this a lot to absorb their food. So endocytosis is cell membrane. Changes shape. And here's the key word, and engulfs. It's kind of a dramatic word, right? So it's going to engulf a particle. Exocytosis, the opposite. So you're going to be removing particles. Now usually in exocytosis, this happens by forming a vacuole around the piece. Okay? So we're going to remove particles by having a vacuole fuse around a particle. And as far as the cell membrane and the way that that plasma membrane regulates things, those are the kind of overlying gist of how it operates. We will talk in depth later, and I always say that because this is kind of layered this year in science. We will talk about some of these processes more in depth, how the energy is used, at what time we actually use the energy. But in general, you should know the difference between passive and active, so something that requires energy, something that doesn't require energy. You should know the difference between diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion. And then you should be able to tell me when endocytosis and exocytosis happen, aka during active transport.